Hello, I'm Jeff Groff, Winterthur's estate historian, and welcome to part two of the evolution of Winterthur. Here you see us on the screen an image of the house as it had been expanded in 1903-04 for H.A. du Pont, a French Renaissance style mansion. Well, H.A. du Pont died on December 31st, 1926. And his son, Henry Francis, inherited a 2,500-acre estate composed of multiple farms, a very large house of over 50 rooms, and a sizable fortune. And H.F. du Pont started planning an expansion of the house. He loved projects, and he had been acquiring a large number of American antiques in the past few years before his father's death. He needed a place to showcase them. He also wanted to create a great house that really would be a memorable place for entertaining for country house parties. So he commissioned a fairly young architect named Albert Ives to design an expansion. As the plans went along, it kept growing and growing to eventually be over 100 rooms. Albert Ives had done work for the DuPont family before in Boca Grande, Florida, and also in the Wilmington area. But this was quite a project when we look at the amount of planning, engineering for all the systems, as well as the house itself. Happily, in the Winterthur archives, we have so many of the plans and details and the correspondence, bills of sale, all of the paperwork for this large two-year project. Well, in the summer of 1929, construction got underway. What it really meant was disassembling the house in many ways that existed it, gutting entire floors, and transforming this French-style house into an American house. It was built with all the latest building techniques using structural steel, reinforced concrete, fireproofing, and also the latest systems to provide not only comfort for the family and their guests, but also to assure protection for the wonderful collections. You can see from these images how it was growing in terms of the overall structure, but on the left too, how the large mature trees, which were very important to H.F. du Pont, were protected. On the right, the wing that would house the dining room and the kitchens, as well as other areas, was 9 stories tall at its highest point. So in many ways, this building really was constructed like a New York skyscraper. At the same time the architectural work was going on, the landscape was being expanded, gardens added, swimming pools, all sorts of new features. The woman overseeing this was the noted landscape architect Marion Coffin, who was actually a good friend of Henry Francis du Pont, and had done garden design at Winterthur as early as the early 1900s. When the house was completed, it was rather unlike anything else that had been seen in America. It's often described as the 4th largest house that had been built, nearly 95,000 square feet. The landscaping and construction of the house cost over $3 million. And that doesn't include the $3.5 million that HF had spent on antiques in the last few years, or the decoration of the interiors of the house. From this aerial view, you get a sense of how it sits into its landscape. And especially to the lower right, you see the more formal garden that once existed, and then that new heated swimming pool. Of course, so much of this was all about showing off these great treasures that H.F. du Pont had been able to acquire. Things like George Washington's Chinese porcelain, pieces from his set with the emblem of the Society of Cincinnati, great needlework, notable paintings, and a set of 6 Paul Revere silver tankards. Now, probably what set Winterthur apart in many ways also was HF's use of historic architecture, what we often refer to as salvage architecture. He was acquiring mantelpieces, door surrounds, windows, a variety of fixtures from different houses up and down the East Coast, particularly in the South and some in New England. But probably the largest acquisition in many ways was from Port Royal, a house from 1760 outside of Philadelphia. H.F. du Pont's, one of his antique dealer agents, had spied this house in very derelict condition. It had been vandalized and basically abandoned. And so du Pont acquired it and used so many of the pieces to create features for his new house. Interestingly, Albert Ives also used it as the inspiration for the large addition on Winterthur that you see to the left. Now, at this point of time, H.F. du Pont was not being that careful about how he was reinstalling a lot of these architectural features. He was not sticking to the exact dimensions or the placement of windows or doors. His goal was to create, in many cases, large spaces for entertaining, and also with so many significant objects he had acquired in the past few years, he needed wall space, he needed floor space, and he wanted to set them off in the best way. On the lower right, you see the parlor at Port Royal as it had been found when H.F. du Pont acquired it. And on the left, as installed at Winterthur, you can see the expansion of wall spaces between windows and other details. On the east side of the house, the East Terrace that Marion Coffin was designing, you had this beautiful view out over the facade and to the dining room porch. And the porch on the right must have been a real treat for the family and their guests when the weather was good. A long trestle table surrounded by Windsor chairs and this great parade of eagles sort of going up and down the table to accent it. Well, by the mid-30s, H.F. du Pont was more seriously thinking about when he would turn Winterthur into a museum. Always loving these projects, he started planning the transformation of a variety of the spaces that had been for the guests' recreation or for servant and back of the house spaces into those that could be used for display. World War II kind of put the brakes on a lot of his plans, but right after the war, work got underway. He now had the preservation architect Thomas Waterman advising him on the project. And so there's much more careful attention to detail as how things are being installed. On the left, you see Shop Lane, which featured a number of historic shop fronts from different states that he'd acquired. And they were installed in his former bowling alley that adjoined a ping pong room and a dancing room. On the right is the image of the China shop at the end with Chinese porcelain and Chinese export furniture. On the 8th floor, there were multiple servants' bedrooms, spaces, pressing rooms, closets, a whole variety of areas that as H.F. du Pont sort of curtailed or downscaled his entertaining with the need for fewer servants, these could be turned into places for display. The wonderful Hardenberg bedroom on the upper left. And on the right, one of his favorite places, Spatterware Hall, where he had this wonderful, colorful collection of spatterware ceramics. In many ways, this particular room replicated something he'd created earlier on at his summer house, Chestertown in Southampton, Long Island. The badminton court or gymnasium became another perfect place to convert and turn into a more theatrical space for his eventual museum. You see it there on the left as the badminton court with the stairs up to the viewing balcony. On the right, in the late 40s, as it's become the Court of Historic Facades. On the right of this image, you see his first installation of a Philadelphia facade, taking various parts and pieces from different historic sites he'd acquired and assembling them into one whole wall. But by the 1960s, this was replaced with an intact facade from a house outside Newport, Rhode Island. This space, both the badminton court and the courtyard before Winterthur opened in 1951 as a museum, were also used by H.F. du Pont to show movies, essentially a home theater for his guests. In the 1960s, much more was being done in the house as the curators were working to create more authentic settings. H.F. du Pont was supporting the acquisition of notable objects and, in several cases, some additional historic architecture and paneling. One of those came from the Gidley House in Newport, Rhode Island, and you see it as installed on the left. And on the right, some of H.F. du Pont's workmen, masons and carpenters, disassembling it at its original site to bring back to Winterthur and install it. What was interesting is until H.F. du Pont's death in 1969, his large staff, who was still overseeing the estate, the farm, the property, was doing so much work also for the museum. Well, in 1951, the house did open as a museum, and in a future episode, I will tell you more about that change and evolution. But I wanted to end today and just remind everyone that Winterthur really does reflect this long period of expansion. And for an American house, it's very unusual that it stayed in multiple generations of one family. So many of these great American mansions and houses were very ephemeral, maybe one, maybe two generations, but they were so fleeting compared to the great houses of England. This is another thing that makes Winterthur so notable. Thank you.